The wind howled across the prairie as Eli Turner, a quiet rancher with calloused hands and a lonely look in his eyes, rode into the McAllister place to buy a horse. The barn smelled of dust and hay, nothing unusual until he heard it. A muffled cry. He followed the sound, heart pounding, to the back stall. There, beneath a tarp, lay a woman, wrists bound, lips bruised, eyes wild with fear. "Please," she whispered, "don't let them find me." Eli froze. The horse he came for snorted behind him, restless. He'd come to trade gold for a stallion, but what he found would change everything he knew about right, wrong, and the price of silence in the Wild West. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. Eli's breath came in shallow bursts as he slipped the knife from his belt and sawed through the ropes binding her wrists, his hand steady, though his pulse thundered like a stampede beneath his skin. The woman winced as the cords fell away, her skin raw and chafed, her lips trembling with the effort to speak. "They'll kill me if they know you saw me," she rasped, her voice barely more than a ghost of sound. "Who?" he started, but the heavy crunch of boots on the dirt outside silenced him. McAllister's voice carried through the barn door, deep, slick, and mean, the kind of drawl that made even honest men feel the weight of sin. "Turner," the ranch owner barked. "You here to make a deal or to waste my morning?" Eli's eyes darted to the door, then back to the woman. She was swaying, half-conscious, her hair matted with dust, eyes glassy with terror. Without thinking, he grabbed her by the shoulders and half-lifted, half-dragged her toward the nearest stall. The hay was dry and prickly beneath his palms as he pulled a tarp over her trembling form, pressing a finger to his lips just as the barn door creaked open. Light spilled across the floor, cutting through the shadows like judgment. "Mornin', McAllister," Eli said, forcing his voice into something easy, slow, harmless. He turned with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hope you don't mind me looking around. Heard you had a stallion for sale." McAllister stepped inside, all spurs and swagger, his bulk filling the space like a storm cloud. "Ain't much to look at, Turner," he said, though his gaze flicked toward the stalls, sharp and measuring. "Still, a fine man like you don't usually ride out this far unless he's hunting for more than a horse." Eli's jaw clenched, but he kept his tone level. "Just a horse. Paid work's been steady. Figured I'd trade up before winter hits." McAllister studied him for a moment too long, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip, then spat into the dirt. "Funny thing," he said, eyes narrowing. "Had a drifter come by last week. Said some thieves were sniffing around. Man's gotta keep a close watch, you know." "Reckon that's true," Eli replied, though his throat felt tight as wire. From beneath the hay came the faintest rustle. A soft cough muffled into silence, and his heart nearly stopped. McAllister's gaze twitched toward the sound, suspicion flaring like a spark in dry grass. "You alone in here?" he asked. Eli stepped forward, blocking the man's line of sight. "Just me and the horses," he said firmly. "If you're selling, I'll pay fair coin. If not, I'll be on my way." The air between them thickened, the smell of sweat and straw hanging heavy. Finally, McAllister snorted, the tension easing into a cold grin. "You always were polite to a fault, Turner. Horse is yours if the gold's good. But I'd watch where you tread out here. Some things in this valley ain't worth digging up." He turned and left, his boots echoing against the boards until the barn swallowed the sound whole. Only then did Eli exhale, his hand shaking as he pulled back the tarp. The woman's eyes found his, wide and terrified but alive. "You should have let him kill me," she whispered. And though her words chilled him, Eli knew by the look in her eyes that it wasn't a threat, it was a warning. The afternoon sun burned low and red as McAllister led Eli down the row of stalls, his easy grin never touching the cold calculation behind his eyes. "Fine stock, ain't they?" he said, clapping a broad hand against the flank of a dapple-gray mare that flinched beneath his touch. Eli nodded absently, though every muscle in his body felt coiled tight, his mind fixed on the hidden woman breathing quietly beneath a blanket of hay just yards away. The air smelled of horses and old fear. "You won't find a better breed this side of the San, Saba," McAllister continued, his drawl smooth as whiskey gone sour. "Course, a man like you quiet, keeps to himself, probably don't need much talking to make up his mind." Eli forced a small laugh. the kind that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Reckon you're right," he said, though his eyes kept drifting toward the back of the barn. McAllister's gaze followed once, sharp as a knife, before he turned back with a smirk that didn't quite mask his suspicion. "Tell you what," he said, "I'll let you have that black stallion for half what I asked. Seems a shame to send a good man riding home empty-handed." Eli knew the price was too generous, knew there was more bait than kindness in that tone, but he nodded anyway, fumbling for his pouch of coins. "Fair enough," he said, handing over the gold just to end the conversation, to get himself and his conscience off that cursed land. McAllister counted the coins slow, his smile lazy but his eyes sharp. "Pleasure doing business, Turner. You take care now, roads get mighty rough after sundown." The warning slid from his mouth like oil, and Eli felt it sink deep into his gut as he mounted up. The stallion snorted, restless, but Eli gave the reins a light tug and turned toward the open prairie. He rode hard until the McAllister place was no more than a black smudge on the horizon, the wind howling through the tall grass like the ghosts of men who'd made wrong choices. But even as the distance grew, he kept looking back once, twice, again half expecting to see McAllister standing in the doorway, half dreading to see nothing at all. By the time he reached his cabin, night had swallowed the sky whole, and the silence pressed against him like judgment. He unsaddled the horse, stabled it in the shed, and poured himself a shot of whiskey that tasted more like regret than comfort. The woman's face haunted him, the bruises, the fear, the desperate plea in her eyes. He'd seen death before, seen cruelty too, but never something that felt this wrong, this personal. He told himself it wasn't his fight, that the smart thing was to stay clear of McAllister's dealings, but the lie rang hollow in his chest. Every creak of the cabin board sounded like footsteps, every gust of wind like her whisper, "Please, don't let them find me." By midnight, he was still awake, staring at the dying fire, the guilt gnawing at him until he could taste the copper of it. Out here, a man could mind his own business and sleep soundly. But Eli Turner, for the first time in a long while, found he couldn't close his eyes without seeing the look of someone who'd already lost everything and still wasn't free. The moon rode high and thin across the prairie, a silver coin cast over a sea of shadow, when Eli Turner found himself back on the trail he swore he'd leave behind. The wind cut sharp through his coat, whispering warnings he ignored, and every hoofbeat of his stallion thudded like a guilty heart against the dirt. He told himself he was a fool, that no good ever came from meddling in another man's evil. But still he rode past the creek, through the cottonwoods, and up the long rise toward McAllister's barn, where the lanterns had gone out and the place slept beneath a blanket of silence too complete to trust. He dismounted in the dark, tying the reins to a fence post slick with dew, and eased the barn door open with a slow, careful hand. The hinges moaned, a soft, wounded sound that made him flinch. Inside, the air hung thick with hay dust and the faint smell of blood. His lantern light cut through the black, and there she was, exactly where he'd left her, curled in the shadows of the back stall, her skin pale beneath the grime, her breath shallow but steady. For a moment he thought she might be dead, until her eyes fluttered open and found his. "You came back," she whispered, her voice cracked and trembling. The backen stirred open and found his, disbelief sharper than fear. Eli knelt beside her, pulling his coat from his shoulders and draping it around her shivering frame. "Couldn't sleep," he said simply. "Figured you shouldn't be left to wolves." She gave a faint, bitter smile, one that looked strange on a face so broken. "They're worse than wolves," she murmured. "Name's Clara." The name felt fragile, like something she hadn't spoken in a long time. "Clara, what?" he asked. She hesitated, eyes darting toward the door before she answered. "Doesn't matter. No one's looking for me." Her fingers picked at the frayed edge of the tarp, voice trembling as she spoke again. "I was supposed to be a wife, a mail-order bride. McAllister sent for me himself, said he was a man of property, a widower needing a good woman to keep house. I came from Georgia, thinking I'd find a new life here." Her throat tightened, and she looked away. "But the men who work for him, they don't deal in cattle. They run slaves across the border, sell them to men in Mexico for gold. I saw too much, heard the wrong things." She lifted her wrists, showing the red welts where the ropes had bitten deep. "When I tried to run, they caught me. Said they'd make sure I never talked again." The words hung between them, heavy as lead. Eli stared at her, every ounce of anger and disbelief rising like wildfire in his chest. "You're saying McAllister's behind that?" he said, his voice low, dangerous. She nodded, tears streaking the dirt on her cheeks. "He owns the men, the horses, the law out here. Ain't no one gonna stop him." For a long moment, Eli said nothing. Outside, the wind rattled the barn walls like distant thunder. "You got somewhere safe to go?" he asked finally. She shook her head. "Nowhere." He reached for her hand, small, cold, trembling, and helped her to her feet. "Then you'll come with me," he said. "Ain't no woman meant to die in the dark while bastards like him ride free." And though Clara tried to protest, her voice broke on a single word. "Why?" Eli had no answer beyond the truth burning in his chest. Because some silences cost too much to keep. The night cracked open around them the moment Eli pulled loose the final knot. The frayed rope falling to the floor like a snake shed of its skin, and just as Clara's trembling hands reached for his, the sudden glare of lantern light split the darkness wide. "Well, ain't this a pretty picture?" A rough voice drawled from the doorway, thick with the smell of whiskey and cruelty. One of McAllister's men, a tall brute with a scar dragging across his cheek, stood there, the lantern swinging in one hand, his other resting on the butt of his revolver. "Boss said no one comes near this stall. Guess you didn't hear that part, Turner." Eli froze, the pulse in his throat hammering so hard he thought the man might hear it. But his voice came calm, steady as the barrel of a gun. "Just checking on the horses. This one looked sick." The man snorted, stepping closer, eyes narrowing as the light caught Clara's face. "Sick, huh? Don't look sick to me. Looks like trouble." His grin spread slow and mean, revealing teeth stained with tobacco. "McAllister'll want her back in the pen. Guess you get to tell him why she ain't there." The moment he reached for her, Eli moved fast, without thinking, his fist slamming into the man's jaw with a crack that echoed off the barn walls. The lantern flew from his hand and shattered, flames licking at the hay before Eli stomped them out, his heart pounding like a war drum. The man staggered back, grabbed for his gun, but Eli hit him again, harder, until he dropped like a sack of grain, blood pooling beneath his cheek. For a second, silence then, the sound of horses stamping nervously, smelling the smoke. "We gotta go," Eli said, grabbing Clara's arm. She nodded, pale but determined, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. "Can you ride?" he asked. Her eyes flashed a flicker of the woman she might have been before all this. "I'll manage." He swung her up onto the stallion, her small frame swaying in the saddle, and vaulted up behind her, the reins snapping in his hands as the horse lunged forward through the half-broken door. The barn exploded into motion, startled horses, scattering hay, the door crashing against its hinges, and then they were out, the cold air cutting their faces as the wind swallowed the evidence of what they'd done. Behind them, a shout rang out, followed by the distant clang of the ranch bell, a sound that meant pursuit. "Hold on," Eli barked, spurring the horse hard as they tore across the open plain, the moon lighting their path like a witness to their sin. The grass whipped at their legs, and Clara clung to him, her breath warm against his collar. "They'll follow," she gasped. "Let 'em try," Eli growled. The stallion thundered over the ridge, hooves striking sparks from the stones, and for a brief, fleeting moment, it felt as if the whole world was just the sound of their flight, one man, one woman, and the wild breath of freedom pounding beneath them. The McAllister ranch shrank behind into shadow, but Eli knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. They had bought themselves only minutes, maybe hours, before the hounds of greed and vengeance were loosed upon the plains. Still, he tightened his grip on the reins, jaw set against the cold. "You're safe now," he said, though the words tasted like a lie. "As safe as we can be." And in that fragile space between pursuit and dawn, they rode two fugitives bound by blood, fear, and a truth that neither yet dared to name. The first light of dawn crept over the plains in long, golden fingers, painting the grasslands in fire and frost, as Eli and Clara rode hard across the open country, the stallions' flanks slick with sweat, the wind tearing the breath from their throats. Behind them, faint but growing, came the low thunder of pursuit, the sound of hooves pounding like a drumbeat of vengeance, carrying McAllister's men closer with every mile. Dust rose on the horizon, a dirty haze that promised hell was coming. "They're gaining," Eli said, glancing back, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "We won't outrun 'em on open ground." Clara's eyes flashed, sharp and clear despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. "There's a river 2 miles east," she shouted over the wind. "Fast and shallow this time of year, they'll lose our trail if we hit it before they do." Eli didn't ask how she knew. He just nodded and turned the horse toward the rising Sunday. The land rolled out before them, dry and cracked, the kind of country that broke men who didn't belong to it. Clara leaned into him, guiding with quiet precision, her voice low but certain. "Keep right at the bluff, the ground's softer there. Won't hold prints." He followed her lead, amazed at the steadiness in her voice, the way fear seemed to sharpen rather than shake her. By the time they reached the riverbank, the sound of their pursuers had become a roar behind them, the men shouting to each other, their curses carried on the morning wind. "Now," Clara urged, and Eli spurred the horse into the freezing water, the shock of it biting through his boots like knives. The current surged around them, tugging at the stallion's legs, but they pressed on, fording to the opposite side where willows grew thick and tangled. There, Clara slid off the saddle, nearly collapsing as her knees hit the mud. "In here," she gasped, pushing through the thicket. They crouched low beneath the canopy of branches, the leaves dripping cold onto their faces, and listened. Within minutes, the riders arrived at the riverbank, the ground trembling beneath their horses' voices barking orders, angry and confused. "Tracks end here," one man shouted. "They must have gone downstream," another cursed. "Or doubled back, spread out." The voices faded slowly, swallowed by the wind and distance, until only the rush of the river remained. Eli exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours, his breath visible in the chill. Beside him, Clara slumped against the trunk of a willow, her hair plastered to her face, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "You did good," he said quietly, brushing the wet strands from her forehead. "You knew exactly where to lead us." She gave a weak smile, the corners of her mouth trembling. "McAllister used to bring his men here after deals," she whispered. "I listened more than they thought I did." He looked at her, really looked, and saw not the broken, frightened woman from the barn, but someone tempered by fire, carved from endurance and grief. The morning light filtered through the leaves, painting her face in shards of gold, and for a moment the world seemed to pause, holding its breath between fear and relief. They sat there, shoulders touching, the river murmuring beside them, their hearts still hammering from the chase. "We bought ourselves a few hours, maybe less," Eli said finally. "Then we keep movin'," Clara replied, her voice soft but sure. And though the danger hadn't passed, in that fragile stillness by the water, both of them understood the same unspoken truth, that survival was no longer just about running, but about standing together against whatever hell came next. The sun climbed slow and hazy through a veil of thin clouds, turning the river to molten silver as Eli and Clara sat hidden among the willows, the wet grass clinging to their clothes, steam rising faintly from their breath in the chill of morning. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence between them felt fragile, holy somehow, broken only by the murmur of the water and the soft ticking of a cooling rifle beside Eli's knee. Clara sat with her knees drawn close, her torn skirt muddied, fingers trembling around the small, bent ring she'd pulled from her pocket, a dull circle of brass that caught the light like something mocking her. "I used to think I knew what my life would be," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady, the words tasting of old pain. "When I answered that advertisement, rancher seeks bride, offers safety and new beginnings, I thought I was leaving misery behind. My daddy died, broke, my mama sick, and I figured the West was where a woman could start over. He sent letters, promises, said he'd meet me in Dodge, marry me proper, give me a home." She turned the ring between her fingers, eyes distant. "But when I got there, it wasn't him who met me. It was his men. They took me straight off the coach, said he was waiting back at the ranch. Only there weren't no preacher, no vows, just a locked room and whiskey on their breath." Her voice wavered then, but she pressed on, her courage trembling but unbroken. I heard 'em talkin' one night. I wasn't no bride. I was property sold before I even set foot on that land. They meant to send me south, to some buyer across the border. When I fought, they tied me up. Said no one would believe me, not out here. Eli's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his stubbled skin. He'd seen hard men in his time, ranch thieves, swindlers, killers, but this was different. A rot that spread from greed and pride. Something foul that turned people into ghosts long before they died. He didn't trust his voice, not at first, afraid the anger might spill too loud and bring the devils right back to them. When he did speak, it was low and rough, like gravel under a boot. "No woman deserves that," he said. Clara blinked, surprised by the gentleness in his tone, as if the words themselves didn't know how to belong in this world. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "Don't have to," he answered. "Wrong's wrong, no matter whose name it carries." She stared at him for a long time, her expression unreadable, something between disbelief and a fragile kind of hope she'd forgotten how to hold. The wind caught her hair, brushing it across her face, and Eli reached out without thinking, tucking it back gently. She didn't flinch this time. Instead, her breath hitched, and for the first time since he'd found her, the wild panic in her eyes softened into something human again. Around them, the world began to wake, birds calling from the reeds, the distant rumble of thunder promising rain by nightfall, but in that small clearing, time felt suspended, caught between confession and grace. Clara looked down at the ring once more, then closed her hand around it and whispered, almost to herself, "Guess I married a ghost." Eli's gaze lingered on her face, the scars, the dirt, the quiet defiance, and in that moment he swore silently that whatever hunted her now would have to go through him first. Eli set the spare revolver on his knee and watched the small, dangerous thing glint in the half-light, feeling the enormity of what he planned settle like winter on his shoulders. Then, without flourish, he told Clara he was going back to McAllister's. She grabbed his sleeve, voice breaking into a raw, animal edge. "You can't," she hissed. "They'll hang you for this. They'll make an example of you." He met her eyes and found in them not only terror but a weary acceptance he had no right to ask for. "Then I'll hang doing what's right," he said, low and steady, the kind of answer that leaves no room for bargaining. He explained the plan plain as a map. Take out the lookout first. Cut the pens where they stowed the men they sold. Make a damn nuisance so McAllister's own pride had to step in and show his face. If the fight turned sour, and it might, he wanted Clara gone before the town woke east, for Miller's Crossing. Then on past Pecos, where men were less likely to know McAllister's name. She begged him, tears streaking the grime on her cheeks, promising any favor, any hiding place. But when he gave her the spare cartridges and showed her which saddle skirt to cinch tight against a storm, she listened as if the sound of his voice might be instruction and comfort both. He packed light 2 days' rations, a bottle, spare cartridges, the green blanket his mother had stitched, and made her watch everything he strapped down as if the sight of it might anchor the plan in reality. "If I don't come back," he said, folding his coat and placing it over her knees in a gesture simple, like tucking a child in. "You ride at first light. Don't wait till dawn when the roads fill. Head east and tell no one I'm dead. They'll use that to chase you farther." Clara's jaw worked. She studied him the way a farmer studies weather, trying to read doom or deliverance in the way he set his shoulders. For the first time since the barn, she saw the man beneath his quiet, not a hero from a story, but a stubborn, broken thing who still chose to stand in the gap between what was right and what was easy. He handed her the spare revolver then, the metal worn smooth where his hand had slid across it in practice. The motion was almost ceremonial, an exchange of trust that cost him nothing and might cost them everything. "Keep it close," he said. "If I don't come back, you ride. Don't look for me." She caught his hand in both of hers, fierce now, no longer the hollowed woman she'd been at McAllister's, and nodded once slow, small, a hard motion that meant she understood across some new language between them. He mounted as the sky paled, the river behind them muttering like a witness, and as he rode toward the ridge that hid McAllister's land, Clara sat with his coat wrapped around her and the spare revolver heavy in her lap, feeling the awful, sharp comfort of having someone to ride for, and the terrible, stubborn courage of a man whose shoulders squared against the chill of what must be done. The sun rose hard and red over the McAllister ranch, spilling light across the corrals like blood on dry boards, and Eli Turner rode into it with his jaw set and his rifle resting easy across the saddle. The place was awake, dogs barking, men moving like ants stirred from a nest, and as he crested the ridge, every part of him knew there was no turning back. His stallion whinnied, hooves striking sparks off the stones, and that sound carried down into the yard like a dare. A shout went up, boots hit the ground, and within seconds the first shot cracked the morning open. Eli dove from the saddle as a bullet tore through his hat brim, hitting the dirt hard, rolling behind the water trough just as splinters flew from a post inches above his shoulder. The smell of gunpowder bit through the dust, the air alive with the scream of lead and the echo of curses. "There!" someone yelled. Eli fired back, the rifle bucking against his shoulder, and one of McAllister's men pitched backward into the dirt, his gun clattering beside him. He reloaded fast, hands moving by instinct, and when another man came running from the stables, Eli's second shot took him square in the chest. The yard went still for half a heartbeat, the smoke curling slow through the sunlit haze, until a voice cut through the silence, deep, cruel, and far too calm. "Well, look what crawled back," McAllister drawled, stepping out from the porch with a shotgun resting easy in his hands. His hat shadowed his eyes, but the grin on his face was all teeth. "You could have had a horse, Turner," he said, cocking the hammer with a slow, deliberate click. "Now you'll have a grave." Eli rose from behind the trough, his revolver steady, dust streaking his face. "I ain't diggin' alone," he said. McAllister laughed a sharp, ugly sound and lifted the shotgun, but before he could fire, another voice cracked through the chaos. "Don't." Both men turned. Clara stood in the doorway of the barn, her hands shaking around the revolver Eli had given her, her dress torn and hair wild in the wind. "Clara," Eli said, low, warning, but she didn't move. McAllister sneered. "Well, I'll be damned." The merchandise learned to shoot. He swung the shotgun toward her, the movement smooth, practiced, and that was when she fired. The sound was small compared to his roar, but it found its mark true. McAllister staggered, shock flashing across his face, the sneer dying before he could curse. The shotgun slipped from his grip, discharging into the dirt as he fell, the blast echoing across the valley before fading into silence. For a moment, no one moved. The smoke drifted. The wind carried the faint rattle of the dying man's breath, and then nothing, only the creak of the barn door and the steady drum of Clara's ragged breathing. Eli lowered his gun, staring at her, the weight of what had just happened settling like dust on his soul. She dropped the revolver, her hands trembling, eyes wide and wet. "He would have killed you," she whispered. Eli stepped forward, catching her before she fell, pulling her against him as the sun climbed higher, burning the last shadows from the yard. Around them lay silence, the kind that follows the end of something long and cruel. McAllister was gone, the men scattered or dead, and the wind moved through the ranch like a sigh of release. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eli Turner looked out across the plains and felt the faint, fragile taste of freedom bought with blood, sealed by courage, and carried by the trembling hand of a woman who refused to die afraid. The world was all fire and dust by the time the gunfire stopped, the sunrise bleeding across the sky like a wound that wouldn't heal, and Eli Turner stood in the middle of it all, swaying slightly, blood slicking his shoulder where a bullet had grazed him clean through. The last of McAllister's men were gone, those not dead had fled, their shouts fading into the open country, leaving behind only the crackle of flames devouring what had once been their master's empire. The barn's roof sagged, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning hay and scorched wood, and through the smoke he could see Clara, her face streaked with soot and tears, moving toward him with that same desperate steadiness that had carried her through every nightmare. She caught his arm before he could fall, her hands slick with his blood, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice breaking as she tried to staunch the wound with a strip torn from her skirt. Eli managed a faint smile through the pain, his hat shadowing his eyes but not the quiet light in them. "I had to," he murmured. Couldn't let the devil keep his due. Behind them, the ranch that had swallowed so many lives was collapsing, beams groaning as fire climbed higher, painting the morning in red and gold. Clara helped him to the horse, the same black stallion that had carried them through the river in the dark, its flanks spattered with ash but its eyes bright with wild fear. She climbed up behind him, her arms around his waist, holding him steady as he gathered what strength he had left to steer. "Where will we go?" she whispered, her words almost lost in the roar of the blaze. He didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the burning house, the corral, the broken fences, all the signs of a kingdom built on cruelty, now turning to smoke. "Doesn't matter," he said at last, his voice rough but sure. "Just away from here." They rode slow at first, the horses' hooves muffled in the churned dirt, the fire's reflection chasing them, across the yard like a second sunrise. The flames roared behind them, swallowing the barn, the pens, McAllister's body, all of it consumed until only the black skeleton of the house remained against the brightening sky. The wind shifted, carrying the smoke eastward, and for a moment Eli turned in the saddle, watching it drift away like the ghost of every wrong that had ever taken root in that soil. He felt Clara's head rest lightly against his back, her breathing uneven but real, alive, the sound of it steadier than the beat of his own heart. Pain flared with every jolt of the ride, but he welcomed it, proof that he was still here, that what they'd done mattered. "It's over," Clara whispered, as if saying it might make it true. Eli's hand found hers where it clutched his coat, and he gave it a faint squeeze. "For now," he said, because men like McAllister left scars deeper than the land they poisoned. But as they crested the hill and the smoke fell behind them, the prairie opened wide and clean before them, endless, empty, full of promise. The wind picked up, sweeping the ashes into the horizon, and for the first time in a long while, Eli felt the weight on his chest ease. They rode east into the rising sun, two silhouettes carved against the morning light, leaving behind the ruin of one man's greed and the birth of something fragile but unbroken justice done not in words or law, but in the quiet, burning truth of smoke and silence. The weeks that followed passed like a long exhale after years of holding one's breath, the violence fading into memory the way a wound fades into scar. And by the time the grass grew green again over the charred places, Eli and Clara had found a small valley tucked between the hills, quiet land, half wild, untouched by greed or ghosts. The cabin they built was nothing grand, just timber and sweat nailed into something resembling a home. But it stood straight, and when the wind moved through the eaves, it sounded almost like peace. Eli spent his mornings mending fences and breaking the stubborn soil for planting, the sun bronzing his skin and the ache in his shoulder reminding him he was still alive. Clara worked beside him, sleeves rolled, hair loose and clean for the first time since he'd met her. Her laughter rare, shy at first, carrying across the meadow like birdsong. There were days when neither spoke for hours, the rhythm of work saying all that needed saying. Days when the only sound was the creak of a well rope or the sigh of wind through wheat. But sometimes, in the stillness of dusk when the sky burned copper and gold, she'd come sit beside him on the porch, the smell of earth and wildflowers clinging to her, and her fingers would find his, light as breath. "You didn't just save me, Eli," she'd say softly, eyes fixed on the dying Sunday. "You found me." And every time, he'd look at her, really look, past the weariness, the scars, the small lines beginning to form at the corners of her eyes, and feel something shift deep in his chest, something that had lain cold and hollow for too many years. "Guess I was the one needed savin' too," he'd answer, his voice low. The kind of truth that didn't need explaining. Nights were still hard sometimes. She'd wake to the echo of gunfire in her dreams, and he'd lie awake beside her, listening to the wind, knowing ghosts didn't disappear, they just learned to sleep quieter. Yet the land began to heal them both. She planted herbs and beans by the window, their roots gripping the soil like they belonged there, and Eli swore the cabin smelled sweeter each morning. A stray dog took to sleeping on the porch, and a pair of doves nested in the rafters, and somehow those small things, life returning where death had lingered, became their salvation. Word spread of the rancher who stood up to McAllister and lived, of the woman who once was lost but found her footing again, though to most they were just another quiet couple, working land no one else wanted. When traders passed through, Clara would offer them water and a smile that held both sorrow and strength, and Eli would tip his hat from the field, the picture of a man who had finally laid down his gun. And as each evening came, painting the sky with the same fire that once burned the McAllister place to ash, they'd stand together at the edge of their little world, watching the horizon blur into twilight, two souls remade by pain and grace alike. No longer running, no longer afraid, simply alive in the quiet promise of the frontier.